All right, so we're diving into estate planning today.
Hmm.
And it can be a tough subject, right? But we're going to try and unpack it in a way that makes it a little less, well, intimidating.
Definitely. I think a lot of people put it off. It feels like something for later. But as we'll see, it's really for everyone, no matter what stage of life you're in.
Exactly. And to help us navigate this topic, we're going to be looking at The Lost Estate by Jermaine Whiteside.
Yeah, this book is really insightful, especially because it focuses on the unique challenges and opportunities in African American and Hispanic communities when it comes to estate planning.
And that historical context is so crucial, isn't it? To really understand why estate planning is so essential for these communities today.
Absolutely. The Lost Estate actually starts with this really powerful story about James Woodstock.
Oh, yeah. James Woodstock. Remind me about his story.
He was an African-American farmer, back during the Jim Crow era.
Right.
And tragically, he ended up losing his entire farm
Wow.
just because he didn't have any estate planning in place.
That's heartbreaking. And it really highlights what's at stake, doesn't it?
It does. And it gets even more impactful when you consider the value of that land today. In 2022, his farm would have been worth almost $1 million.
$940,000 to be exact.
That's a whole legacy, just gone.
It's a stark reminder of how generational wealth can slip away so easily. And it underscores why this deep dive is so important. I mean, for everyone, really, but especially for communities that have faced systemic barriers to wealth accumulation.
Right. And The Lost Estate does a great job of exploring those systemic factors. The legacy of slavery, Jim Crow laws, redlining, all of these things have contributed to the wealth disparities we see today.
It's about more than just protecting what you have in the present. It's about reclaiming what was lost and building a solid foundation for future generations.
Exactly. And The Lost Estate doesn't just dwell on the problems, it actually gives you the tools and knowledge to take action.
Which is what we're all about here.
Exactly. So one of the first things it really emphasizes is the power of having a will.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. For someone who's completely new to this, what exactly does a will do? And what happens if you don't have one?
Sure. So a will is basically a legal document, and in it you lay out exactly how you want your stuff, your assets, to be distributed after you pass away.
Okay.
Now, if you don't have a will, that's called dying intestate.
Intestate.
That means the state gets to decide how your property is divided. And that might not be what you want at all. Like, your assets could end up going to distant relatives instead of the people you actually want to benefit.
That's kind of a scary thought, isn't it? Not having any control over where your things end up.
It really is, and it can create a lot of unnecessary conflict and chaos for your loved ones.
Yeah, not the legacy anyone wants to leave behind.
Exactly. The Lost Estate even uses this case study, the Jones family, to show what can happen if you don't have a will. And they made some really common mistakes, actually. Not having a will at all, no life insurance, they hadn't designated a guardian for their kids, and they never even talked about any of this with their family. All of these things could be avoided with a little bit of planning. It makes you realize that having those open conversations with your loved ones is just as important as having the legal documents in place.
Absolutely. It's about preventing misunderstandings and potential disputes down the road, right?
You got it. And this actually leads into another key point the book makes about navigating those, sometimes complicated family dynamics.
Because not all families are created equal, right? You've got blended families, multiple marriages, all kinds of situations.
Exactly. And estate planning needs to be flexible enough to account for those different dynamics. Which, speaking of complexity, there's another area the book delves into that I found really interesting: digital assets.
Ooh, that's a big one these days. I mean, our lives are so intertwined with the digital world.
Right. They actually share a story about this woman named Tina. She lost her husband, and he hadn't made any plans for his digital stuff. So she ended up completely locked out of his online account.
Oh, no. What kinds of accounts are we talking about?
Everything. Bank accounts, social media, even valuable things like cryptocurrency.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a problem.
And it's becoming more and more common, which is why The Lost Estate talks about this idea of a digital asset executor.
Okay, what's that?
So basically, it's someone you specifically designate to manage your digital legacy. They'll have access to your accounts and can follow your instructions for what to do with them. It's like having a will for your online life.
So you're not just thinking about physical possessions anymore. It's about your entire digital footprint.
Exactly. And the good news is the book lays out some pretty simple steps you can take right now to protect those assets.
I think that's something a lot of people don't even think about. It's like we're so used to the physical world, we forget about all the valuable stuff we have online.
Right. And this is actually where The Lost Estate takes a really interesting turn. It starts talking about the unique role that churches play, especially in African American and Hispanic
Oh,
communities.
that's an angle I hadn't really thought about before.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The book talks about the historical and cultural significance of churches as like these central hubs for the community.
Right. They offer so much more than just religious services.
Exactly. They provide social services, educational programs, you name it.
So the lost estate is making a connection between estate planning and these community institutions.
It is. It actually asks this really thought-provoking question. What if we start thinking about empowering churches as beneficiaries,
Hmm.
especially in cases where there aren't any direct heirs?
Interesting. So instead of those assets being lost or going to the state, they could actually help sustain these institutions and all the good work they do.
Exactly. The book even talks about setting up something called a church endowment fund.
And how would that work?
Well, it could be used for all kinds of things, like funding community outreach programs, providing scholarships, even just helping the church maintain its building and keep those vital services going. It's almost like using estate planning as a tool for collective empowerment.
That's a really powerful concept. It expands the whole idea of what estate planning can achieve.
It does. And it ties into this broader theme that runs throughout the book, this idea of stewardship,
Hmm.
being responsible with what you've been given. There's this great quote from the author, Jermaine Whiteside. He says, estate planning is not just a financial decision, it's a spiritual one.
I love that. It adds a whole other dimension to the conversation, doesn't it?
It really does. And in that context, the book brings up this idea of final expense insurance.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't familiar, what exactly is that?
Well, it's basically a type of insurance specifically designed to cover end-of-life expenses, things like funeral costs and outstanding medical bills.
Okay, so it's taking care of those practical things.
Exactly. And the Lost Estate argues that having this kind of insurance in place is a huge relief for your loved ones. They can grieve without that added financial burden.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And they even tie it back to that biblical idea of providing for your family. There's a reference to 1 Timothy 5.8, which talks about that responsibility.
So it's not just a practical thing, it's also framed as a spiritual responsibility.
Right. And the book even suggests that pastors and church leaders should be advocating for final expense insurance as part of their guidance to their congregations. It's about aligning your actions with your values, and making sure your loved ones are taken care of.
I like how the lost estate is weaving together practical advice with this spiritual aspect. It's a really holistic approach to estate planning.
It is. And speaking of practical solutions, there's one more thing I wanted to mention that the book brings up. It's this really innovative idea called an insurance cooperative program, specifically designed for churches.
Ooh, tell me more about that.
So imagine this. Churches pool their resources together to create a self-funded insurance program for their members.
Wow.
It's like this really cool modern take on that traditional idea of lending a helping hand, but with a structured system to make it sustainable.
So it's about community support built into the system.
Exactly. And the best part is, the book actually lays out a step-by-step guide on how to set something like this up. It talks about choosing the right insurance provider, establishing fair donation guidelines, managing the program effectively.
So it's not just a pie-in-the-sky idea. It's a concrete plan with actionable steps.
You got it. And it really empowers churches to create their own solutions and take care of their members in a way that aligns with their values. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
We have, from the historical injustices that have led to wealth disparities, to the power of having a will, all the way to these really innovative ideas like the church cooperative program.
Yeah. The Lost Estate is shaping up to be quite the comprehensive guide, wouldn't you say?
It definitely is. And I feel like we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack, especially when it comes to those practical strategies and action steps the book lays out.
Well, good thing we have more time, right?
Exactly. So why don't we take a break here and come back in part 2 to dive deeper into those practical aspects of estate planning. What do you say?
Sounds good to me. Welcome back. Ready to get into the nitty-gritty of estate planning.
Absolutely. We've laid the groundwork, talked about the why. Now let's get into the how. So where does the lost estate suggest we begin?
Okay, so the book really emphasizes this idea that building a solid estate plan, it's like building a house. You need that strong foundation with all these different pieces working together.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
And one of the first things they dive into is understanding the different types of insurance policies.
Insurance. So not just about the will itself.
Right. They go beyond that, beyond just thinking about insurance as something that covers burial costs.
Because usually people think of life insurance when they think about estate planning.
Right. But they explore how insurance can actually be this powerful tool for building wealth and protecting what you've already built.
See, that's what I was talking about. Most people don't think of insurance that way. What kind of insights does the book offer there?
Well, they really break down these different types of insurance, like not just life insurance, but also health insurance, disability insurance, even long-term care insurance.
Long-term care insurance. I don't think I've ever heard that mentioned in the context of estate planning before.
Right. It's not something people usually think about. But the lost estate makes this really compelling argument for why it's so important.
Okay, I'm curious. Why is it so important?
Well, you have to plan for the possibility that, at some point you might need long-term care,
Right.
and that can be expensive. So having that insurance in place, it protects your assets from being drained by those costs.
That makes sense. You don't want to wipe out your savings just to cover care costs.
Exactly. And it also makes sure you can get the care you need without burdening your loved ones.
That's a really important point, especially as we get older. It's not just about protecting what we have now, it's also about planning for our future well-being.
You got it. And this actually brings us back to something we talked about earlier. Remember that idea of creating an insurance cooperative program for churches?
Oh, yes. That was such a fascinating idea. I'd love to hear more about that.
Okay, so the Lost Estate actually provides these step-by-step guidelines for how to set up this kind of program within a church.
So it's not just a theoretical concept.
No, they give you the actual steps. They walk church leaders through the entire process from start to finish.
Okay, like what kinds of things do they cover?
Well, for example, they talk about how crucial it is to carefully choose an insurance provider, one that's reputable and trustworthy.
Makes sense. You want to make sure it's a solid program.
Right. And they talk about setting up clear donation guidelines, making sure everything is fair and transparent, and then, of course, managing the program effectively so that it actually works the way it's supposed to.
So it's a really practical guide then.
It is. And that focus on practicality, it extends to this other really important area, which is financial literacy.
Okay, financial literacy. How does that tie into estate planning?
Well, the book is a big advocate for having financial education initiatives within churches.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about individual planning, it's about empowering the entire community.
Right. It's about demystifying these complicated financial concepts, giving people the tools they need to feel confident when it comes to things like insurance and estate planning. It can be intimidating.
Oh, absolutely. Especially if you've never dealt with it before. It can feel really overwhelming.
Exactly. And this actually ties back to that whole theme of stewardship we've been talking about. It's about taking ownership of your finances, being responsible with what you've been given, both for yourself and for your community.
I love how the lost estate is bringing all these different pieces together. It's not just about legal documents. It's about a whole mindset, a way of approaching your finances and your legacy.
You got it. And the book doesn't shy away from the fact that these conversations can be really tough.
Oh, yeah. Talking about death and estate planning. Not exactly light dinner conversation.
Right. It can be difficult, even uncomfortable, especially within families. But the lost estate really encourages people to have those open and honest conversations.
Because avoiding the conversation doesn't make the issue go away, right?
Exactly. And it can actually make things a lot harder down the line. So the book offers some guidance on how to navigate those sensitive family dynamics.
Okay, like what kind of guidance?
Well, it talks about how to address potential conflicts, how to make sure everyone's wishes are heard and respected, things like that.
So it's almost like a guide to having those tough conversations then.
It is. And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I think it's important to emphasize this overall message of empowerment that comes through in The Lost Estate.
Empowerment. Okay, tell me more about that.
The book really reminds us that estate planning, it's not just about legalities and paperwork. It's about taking control of your legacy, shaping the future you want for yourself and your loved ones.
Instead of just letting things happen by chance.
Exactly. It's about being proactive. The Lost Estate specifically equips readers, especially in those African American and Hispanic communities, to understand the unique challenges they face, the resources that are available to them, and the steps they can take to protect those hard-earned assets.
It's about breaking those cycles of wealth loss that have been so persistent.
You got it. And that concluding chapter in the book, it really drives that point home.
What does it say?
Well, it lays out this whole vision for empowering these communities through proactive planning, through education, through this renewed sense of ownership over their financial futures.
It sounds like a call to action.
It is. But while we've covered a lot of ground, I feel like we've only just touched on the practical advice that the lost estate offers.
Yeah, that's true. We talked about the importance of wills and trusts, but we haven't really gotten into the specifics of how they work.
Right. And then there's this whole other area of tax implications, which I know can feel really complicated.
Oh yeah, taxes. Nobody wants to think about those.
I know. But the book does a really good job of breaking down those tax considerations.
Okay, good.
It helps you understand how to minimize your tax burden and make sure that those hard-earned assets are passed down efficiently.
So, should we dig into those specific legal tools and strategies, including those tax implications, in our next segment?
Let's do it. I think our listeners are going to find it really valuable.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the lost estate. We covered a lot of ground, the historical context, why planning matters, even explored some unique approaches like that church cooperative program we talked about.
Yeah, we've really gotten into the heart of it.
We have. But now it's time to get into the nuts and bolts, the actual legal tools and strategies that everyone needs to know about.
Yeah.
To build that solid estate plan.
Right, the stuff that makes it all happen.
Exactly. And I think the lost estate does a really great job of breaking these concepts down in a way that's actually understandable. So where do we begin?
Well, we've talked about wills quite a bit already, so it seems like a good place to start, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, let's do it. What are those key elements that everyone needs to know about when it comes to creating a will?
All right, so think of a will like a roadmap. It guides what happens to your assets after you're gone.
Okay, a roadmap. I like that.
It lays out who gets what and how. So the book really stresses how important it is to clearly identify your beneficiaries.
Beneficiaries, those are the people or organizations who will inherit your things, right?
Exactly. And you can get really specific. You can designate a certain amount, a percentage, or even particular items for each person.
So it's not just splitting everything equally.
Nope, not necessarily. You can tailor it to fit your own unique situation, your relationships, all of that.
Got it. So that's beneficiaries. What else?
The other big thing is naming an executor.
The executor. Remind me, what's their role again?
So the executor is the person you trust to actually carry out your instructions.
Yeah.
They manage the whole process of distributing your estate according to your will.
So you want to choose someone who's really responsible.
Absolutely. Someone who's capable and organized, and most importantly, someone you trust to honor your wishes.
Makes sense. Now, what happens if you don't name an executor?
Well, if you don't have a will at all, or if you don't specify an executor, the court will actually appoint someone for you.
Oh, so it's not like everything just floats around in limbo?
Nope. The state steps in. And the problem is that might not be the person you would have chosen.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's better to be proactive and make that decision yourself.
Exactly. Okay, now we've talked about wills, but there are also trusts.
Trusts. Yeah, those seem a little more complicated.
They can be, but they're also really powerful tools. So a trust is basically a legal arrangement, and it's where you have a trustee, who can be a person or an institution, that holds and manages assets for the benefit of your beneficiaries.
Okay, so it's like this separate entity that holds your stuff according to your instructions.
You got it. And there are a lot of different types of trusts, each with its own specific purpose.
So when would someone actually need a trust instead of just a will?
Well, there are a lot of different scenarios where a trust might be a better fit. For example, if you have a child with special needs, a trust can protect their eligibility for government benefits while still making sure they're financially taken care of.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or let's say you want more control over how your assets are distributed over time. Maybe you want to set up a trust that releases funds to your kids at certain ages or milestones. A trust can do that.
So it's about having that extra level of control and flexibility.
Exactly. The lost estate actually goes into detail about all the different types of trusts, like living trusts and testamentary trusts. They explain all the pros and cons of each one.
That sounds really helpful, especially if you're trying to figure out which option is right for you.
It is. Now, before we wrap up, there's one more legal tool I want to touch on, and that's powers of attorney.
Powers of attorney. Yeah, we mentioned those briefly earlier, but I'd love to hear more about how they fit into the bigger picture of estate planning.
Okay, so powers of attorney are essential because they make sure your affairs are handled properly, even if you become unable to make decisions yourself.
Okay, so if I were to become incapacitated, for example.
Exactly. You designate someone as your power of attorney, and they can step in and manage things according to your wishes. And there are different types, one for your finances, one for healthcare decisions, even one specifically for your digital assets.
So it's all about having that plan in place for those unexpected events,
Right.
right? Making sure your values and priorities are honored no matter what.
Exactly. You've got it.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. Seriously. We started with those historical injustices that have led to so much wealth disparity, and then we explored all these practical tools and strategies that can help individuals and entire communities reclaim their financial futures.
I agree. It's been an amazing journey.
The lost estate has really made me realize the importance of being proactive, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that come after us.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And to our listeners, I hope you feel empowered to take that next step. Estate planning, it's not just about protecting your stuff. It's about honoring your values, taking care of your loved ones, and leaving a legacy that truly reflects who you are.
It's about writing the next chapter of your story, but with intention and purpose.
Exactly. So go out there and create a plan that reflects your hopes and dreams. Your future self will thank you.
And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the lost estate. Thanks for joining us.